This is a panel discussion on Somalia's dynamic threat. All right, so let me introduce our first discussant, our presenter, and it's Dr. Tricia Bacon from American University. And while I'm introducing her, she will be getting ready. It's the effective leadership decapitation on Al-Shabaab in Somalia.
From my standpoint, this is actually part of a much larger book project, and the project is sort of reverse engineering, looking at the leadership decapitation literature, but asking a broader question about what role leaders play in contemporary militant groups. What are their functions, what are their primary purposes, and what is the impact of the prominent use of decapitation as a tactic? What influence is that actually having on militant groups? But this is sort of the initial phases of that. And one of the things that me and my co-author are doing is looking at various organizations who have experienced leadership decapitation and trying to assess the effects of decapitation on those groups. So as first things first, what do I mean when I say leadership decapitation? Of course, with a lot of current militant groups, we see broader efforts to engage in targeted killings of members of the group. We are talking very specifically here about eliminating the leadership, either capturing or killing the leader of these organizations, not broader efforts to target members of the group. So it's a little bit narrower, and sometimes people use those terms interchangeably, but we mean leadership decapitation as the leader, the leadership figure of an organization. When you look at the current literature on leadership decapitation, you end up more confused than when you started. There's been a number of effects that have been evaluated in the works to date. They include, and these are probably the primary ones that have been looked at, and some people specify rebel groups, some people specify terrorist groups, some people say insurgent groups. We're taking sort of a broad look at the potential effects. So people have looked at the potential effect on conflict outcomes, on organizational survival, on organizational capability, specifically the number and the lethality of attacks conducted by the group, on retaliatory violence, on radicalization, and on recruitment. So in terms of conflict outcomes, it's interesting because I think this is probably the biggest claim that one could make, is that leadership decapitation has some impact on how conflicts end, but there actually are a couple of studies that suggest that is indeed the case. Both Johnson and Tierney find that there is an increased chance of conflict termination and even government victory that's associated with leadership decapitation. Interestingly, one of the sub-findings is that the decapitation of a founding leader has particularly disproportionate effects compared to subsequent leaders. There's much less consensus on the organizational survival front. In fact, there's directly contradictory findings on this. A prominent piece on this by Price finds that leadership decapitation significantly increases a group's mortality rate, and that it does take some time, that it takes several years before that effect happens, but it is an effect that occurs. Jenna Jordan, on the other hand, not only found that leadership decapitation doesn't contribute to organizational death, it actually prolongs how long an organization will survive. Interestingly, they both find that leadership decapitation has much more of an effect on younger organizations. And the threshold that seems to they have both identified is around 10 years. So once an organization hits 10 years, the effect of leadership decapitation reduces significantly. In terms of organizational capability, this is also an area where there is some tentative consensus. And 3 different studies have found that leadership decapitation is associated with fewer subsequent attacks, though Deere specifically found that this only occurred in the short term. There was a short-term reduction of the number of attacks, but then there was a recovery in terms of the number of attacks. Then on lethality, we have contradictory findings on this. Johnson found that there is a reduction in the intensity of violence after leadership decapitation, but 2 subsequent studies disagreed with that. And one of them actually posited why this was the case. And the argument was, when you kill the leader, you lose some of the command and control over the rank and file, and they're more likely to engage in indiscriminate violence. One of the other positive effects of leadership decapitation is retaliation, that you're going to see, especially in societies where there's a need for collective revenge. Deere argues that you're going to see retaliation following leadership decapitation. And certainly just this week, ISIS declared just that it would engage in retaliatory violence for the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Mahmoud looked at specifically the decapitation of the leaders of Pakistani Taliban and found that there was this kind of retaliation after the elimination of leaders. Several studies have posited that you can actually radicalize an organization by decapitating its leader. In other words, more radical leaders tend to rise to the helm after you eliminate a leader, either by capturing or killing them. So this is one of the potential sort of backfiring effects that leadership decapitation can have. And then finally, one of the arguments against leadership decapitation is that you're essentially making a martyr of the leader, and you're then creating more sympathy and more people will join the organization. So that's where the literature is. As I say, there's very little consensus on a lot of these points. Some of them are arguments that are not empirically tested. Sometimes you have contradictory findings. It's a very hard literature to parse through, and it doesn't really offer policymakers a lot of guidance. I think everyone could sort of pick what they want to see in some of this literature. So we're looking specifically at Al-Shabaab and its founding leader, the death of its founding leader. He came to the position with significant sort of outside experience. He was educated in Pakistan, he was a foreign fighter in Afghanistan. He didn't really have significant religious credentials. He had some credentials as in insurgency and in combat, but he didn't really have religious credentials. Importantly, he was from Somaliland. He was not from southern Somalia, so he had a clan affiliation outside of southern Somalia. And he was very much on the side of the organization that wanted Somalia to be part of a global jihadist agenda. He didn't see it sort of as a nationalist cause unto itself. He had this broader agenda. So looking through his role in the organization, in the early years, he was appointed as the leader of the group. And he became the official leader when the group broke away from the Islamic Court Union. But really the sense that scholars and analysts had at the time is you had a group that was leading the organization. He was a peer among equals, of sort of a council of leaders who were leading the organization that didn't have a lot of power onto himself. But this period was very much the height of the group's pan-clan dynamic, where it was trying to present itself as having transcended clan and that it crossed clan. And his outside clan status really helped the organization to do that and to avoid being seen as particularly affiliated with one of the clans in southern Somalia. And this was also a period where the group established its organizational unity to a degree that really hadn't been seen before. It was an impressive level of unity for the organization, and this is when it really, after the Ethiopian invasion, when the group is generating its insurgency against the Ethiopian forces. In the next period, you have the state building, when the Ethiopian forces withdraw, and the group sort of storms through southern Somalia, capturing territory. And this was a contradictory period in some ways for the organization. It seems like it's in some ways the height of the organization because it has all this territorial control. It becomes more coherent and more institutionalized. It becomes more of a functional organization. But there's also a lot of pitfalls that come with the governing of the territory. In particular, there's an increase in sort of clan tensions, particularly when the group has to take over territory and members of its leadership have to deal with the clan dynamics of their particular clan affiliation. And you also, when you have this kind of massive influx of members, you have a lot of opportunism going on, people who aren't joining because they're necessarily committed to the ideology. But what we see during this period is there is still a council of leaders, but Godani is accruing more and more influence and seems to be trying to garner more influence in the organization and consolidate more power. Then we run into, after the group starts to be at this apex, there's a famine in Somalia, and Godani becomes convinced that the group has to take Mogadishu. And these turn out to be two very contentious issues. The handling of the famine in particular really exacerbates the clan dynamics. And the idea that Godani, because he's from an outside clan, is not being sufficiently responsive to the needs of the people, and he's seen as as being heartless in the way that he is depriving people of the aid during the famine. And he's simultaneously pushing for a very robust offensive in Mogadishu particularly against Amisom, but in particular the Ugandan forces there. So we see the distension that the seeds of which occurred during the last period really start to take hold during this time. And there's even efforts to unseat him, which don't succeed. He is unwilling to be unseated even when there's a council that comes together and decides that he should give up the position. Instead, he grows more and more dictatorial and consolidates control. And in particular, he uses the group's intelligence wing as sort of his own little special forces in order to start to target some of his rivals. And this is the period where he either sidelines or in some cases kills a number of his critics and his rivals. And what emerges from this is a much smaller organization in terms it doesn't control as much territory, doesn't have as much power, but it's a much more cohesive organization once he has stripped away his critics and his rivals. So it's a weaker group in a lot of ways, but it's a much more cohesive group under his leadership, and that's willing to adhere to his agenda. And the group really controls at this point not any major cities, but rural areas, but it can conduct attacks in Mogadishu and strike in Kenya. So this is sort of the trajectory of Godani's role in Al-Shabaab between 2007 and about 2014. And in September 2014, he's killed in a US airstrike. And at the time, just like we're seeing now with Baghdadi, there's a lot of speculation about the impact that this will have. There was a sense that there would be a lot of internal dissension that would come out of his loss, that there would be ideological contestation about whether this should be a more nationalist-focused group or a more globally focused group. Some predicted it would become rudderless and unstable because he'd done so much to consolidate power in the intervening period that his loss would really destabilize the group. And then there were others who said the day-to-day operations won't be affected, but strategically the organization will be. So using the basis of the literature, I'm looking 5 years later. What was the effect on the organization? Oh, sorry, I messed up my effects there. That's what you get when you try to be fancy. So I think it's obvious to say to everybody in this room, from a conflict termination standpoint, this did not have an effect. Even at 5 years, Price argues that 2 years is too short of an increment. Looking at 5 years, there's been no sort of movement in resolving the conflict. There's been no shift. We are really at a mutually hurting stalemate at this point. And this is particularly notable because he was the founding leader. And the previous studies have found that that's a particularly significant loss from a conflict outcome standpoint. We also don't see an effect on organizational survival. The group has persisted, shows no sign of breaking significantly or ceasing to operate. And this is particularly interesting as well because the group is less than 10 years old at the time of leadership decapitation. So it's running counter to some of the average effects in these first two categories. I looked at the number of attacks that the group conducted. And when Godani was killed, the group was really that year at the apex of the number of operations that it had conducted. It had been in an increase and it was at a peak. And we do see a short-term decline the year after his death and then a recovery the subsequent 2 years. So there was a short-term dip in the number of attacks, but then there's some recovery, although it hasn't gotten quite back to 2014 levels. The information on lethality turned out to be much more inconclusive than I expected, and that's in part because one of the main data sets that I was using indicates they don't have conclusive numbers of the number of people killed in a lot of Al-Shabaab's attacks, which, again, I don't think surprises a lot of us, but there was, I think, over 600 attacks where they couldn't really give a good estimate of how many people were killed. So I think that that was an inconclusive finding. Some previous research on the topic suggested that Al-Shabaab engaged in more increased targeting of civilian targets post-Godani's death. In terms of retaliation, the group vowed to do that in the statements right after Godani's death, but then they only attributed one attack, which was an attack on one of the Amisom bases, they said this is in retaliation for Godani's death. We didn't see a large spree of retaliatory attacks after his death. In terms of radicalization, we don't see that there's more radical leaders that took the helm of the organization. And I'll talk about the next leader in a minute, but he's basically cut very much from the same cloth as Godani. So it wasn't a more radical leader, nor was it really a less radical leader. That's sort of a null finding. Now, I think in terms of numbers, I admit I'm a little bit of a skeptic oftentimes when we try and come up with estimates of how large these organizations are. But when I looked at the numbers that are available, we do see an increase in the size of the group in the years after Godani's death. And I think that's a particularly interesting finding. I don't know that we can fully attribute it to his death, but there has been a growth in the organization in the years following his death. The individual who took over in his wake was relatively unknown at the time. He might have been someone who was well known amongst Shabaab circles, but he wasn't well known amongst analyst circles. He came from Godani's inner circle. He had a governor's role in the organization, but interestingly, since he's taken over, he's been largely invisible. evidenced by like the random kind of photo I had to find on Google of him. He's not very often seen in the propaganda. He's not very public. There's frequent speculation, I'm going to say twice a year, that he's been killed or he's died from some kind of natural causes. He's reputed to be ill, and that it could be a Mullah Omar situation where he will be dead for some time before we actually learned that that's happened. So he doesn't have sort of Godane's domineering dictatorial leadership style, but he's continued the course that Godane has set in terms of the organization's activities and its ambitions. So he's taken more of a caretaker role of forwarding Godane's initial agenda. And I think one of the things that emerged to me in thinking about this, going beyond what the literature says about decapitation, is that decapitation may have had a much more stark effect if it had happened earlier. That by the time Godane was killed, he had consolidated his position and he had consolidated the organization around those loyal to him. And if it had happened when there was still more relative moderates or more relative nationalists within the group, we might have seen a much different effect, or at least much more internal dissension about who would take the helm and how the group would function thereafter. But I think one of the things that emerges in the leadership decapitation literature is very stark positions on whether it hurts an organization or it helps it. And I think in this case, I didn't find that you could really take a strong position on that one way or another. If you're looking for big strategic effects, like conflict outcomes and organizational survival, it clearly didn't hurt the group. But on some of the other factors, it goes both ways. It's sort of mixed or it's inconclusive. So I don't think this is a case you can make a strong case for leadership decapitation based on the Al-Shabaab experience, nor can you say that it significantly helped the organization. So it is very much sort of a muddling along in terms of that. So I'll be happy to defer to my colleagues' presentations now and then take questions at the end.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Well, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Dan Van Leeman. He and I are colleagues at Portland State University, and we have worked together on a study called the Somali Minority Study. And I'll talk about some of our broader findings and then talk a bit specifically about the findings on women and girls. Somalia is a geographically large country of 19 million people, and it's one where there's been ongoing conflict, particularly since the early 1990s when the authoritarian regime was overthrown. We usually think of Somalia as being a failed state as a result of all of this conflict. And we think as well about Al-Shabaab, the rise of Al-Shabaab, which emerged out of the Union of Islamic Courts during the conflict. Somalia is a humanitarian crisis. There are over 1 million refugees from Somalia and 2.6 million internally displaced people. So it's a very important topic. And we, in our study, wanted to try to understand in particular, how does Al-Shabaab govern, and why has it been able to survive through these decades of international involvement and action by the United States as well? The U.S. has been involved in Somalia on and off since the early 1990s, and currently has approximately 500 troops that are stationed near Kismayo, the regional capital in the south. This is part of a broader United Nations assistance mission to Somalia. There's also an important presence of the African Union mission in Somalia, which includes troops from several countries: Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Burundi, which is focused on trying to wrest control of particularly the southern parts of Somalia from Al-Shabaab and try to establish state control over the entire territory. Al-Shabaab continues to attack these international forces and controls several areas of territory, particularly in the south of Somalia. Somalia is divided into 18 administrative regions, and politically, constitutionally, there's the presence of a 4.5 political system which divides access to power and resources among the clans. Somalia is a deeply ethnicized, deeply clan-based society in which historically clans have been the primary socio-political unit that individuals look to for their security and their resources. There's also a very distinctive power structure across the tribes. Majority clans have more access within the political system than minority clans, the largest of which is the Somali Bantu. The Somali Bantu are the descendants of largely freed slaves whose traditional homeland is the southern parts of Somalia. They are ethnically distinct, although they are Muslims, and they have distinctive physical features and are considered to have low society or low social status within Somali society. They are underrepresented in the 4.5 political system, and they're also excluded from the traditional authority structure, which gives power to traditional elders within the clans. The Bantu are excluded from these institutions. Moreover, the Bantu do not intermarry with members of majority clans, although there's a fair amount of intermarriage across the clans, sometimes to solidify clan alliances. The Bantu are considered to be low social status, and they don't intermarry with members of majority clans. Somalia writ large has many of the conditions that lead to child marriage. Although it's illegal in Somalia for girls to marry before the age of 18, there are today more child marriages in the country than there are women in secondary school. So the impact of the conflict has been a negative for girls in terms of the government's ability to implement marriage, the minimum age of marriage at age 18. However, this doesn't mean that young girls don't often exercise choice in these marriages. Some of the literature that I found on this topic suggested that young couples would often elope, for instance, to try to circumvent their family's choice of marriage partner. So there's kind of a lot of complexity, but child marriage is very common. Marriage to Al-Shabaab fighters is also common, and this can be something that leads to an improvement in social status for a girl and her family, particularly if she's from a majority clan. And this may be something that may be desired by the girl or her family. In our study, we wanted to try to understand the experience of forced marriage across the different clans, and we particularly wanted to know if girls from minority groups are being forcibly married to Al-Shabaab fighters, and if their experiences differ from those of majority clan girls whose narratives are not well known, but there are some articles about their experiences. And I want to mention as well, in Somali studies, there's a trope that's referred to as the myth of homogeneity. A scholar in the past made the statement that Somalia is a homogeneous country. And while Somali scholars do not accept this today, this argument still has broad resonance in the policy community. And what this essentially means is that it should be puzzling that there's conflict in Somalia because everyone's from the same religion and it's a homogenous country. But in fact, it's deeply clan-based and it's deeply structured in terms of the power structure across the different clans. So it is a very ethnically diverse place. So the research questions that we wanted to study with our survey is we first just wanted to know, how does Al-Shabaab survive? How does it govern? And we looked to the rebel governance literature, and we wanted to understand how Al-Shabaab uses extraction, like tax collection and exploitation, as well as service provision to establish itself and survive as an organization within the local population. And then we also wanted to understand what is the role of women and girls in this movement. There's some literature that suggests that women within Al-Shabaab participate directly through recruitment, generating funds, carrying out attacks. So they provide sort of productive support in these ways, and they also provide reproductive support by marrying fighters, having children, raising children, who then join the movement. But we noticed that this literature was absent a focus on the clan power dynamics, and we wanted to know more about women's role across these different clans in this way. The 2017 Somali Minorities Survey was conducted among 139 households, Bantu households, and these were households which were displaced from Somalia within the year prior to the survey. It was conducted face-to-face between October and December 2017 by local interviewers and used quota sampling to draw as representative a sample as we could of both men and women, as well as people from the 5 primary administrative districts in the south of Somalia where there's a high population of Bantu. And it was approved by an institutional review board at Portland State University. So I want to share 2 broad findings from the survey. The first finding is that we find that Al-Shabaab is primarily utilizing extraction as a way of maintaining its power in Somalia. It's providing very little service provision. So to put this into context, there's a literature on ISIS that is trying to understand to what extent was and is ISIS attempting to establish a social contract with the population? To what extent is ISIS trying to extract taxation as well as provide services in order to establish a state and gain support within the population? We found that, in fact, Al-Shabaab focuses pretty much primarily on extraction through the collection of zakat, house taxes, harvests, forced labor or low-paid labor, conscription of boys into their movement, and forced marriage of girls. So we found that these were the extraction techniques that were used by Al-Shabaab. The service provision was very limited and only to establish and support the extraction. So for instance, the establishment of Islamic courts to, in some cases, exploit the local population, but also the provision of security services to members of dominant clans who would then be acting as middlemen, essentially, to help in the wartime economy, to support the transportation, for instance, of charcoal that was produced through the local labor for export. So we found Al-Shabaab is primarily focused on the use of extraction techniques. Our second finding is that Al-Shabaab utilizes an ethnicized governance strategy that takes advantage of the local power dynamics across the clans. We found that extraction took place for all people in southern Somalia, but the Bantu were subject to greater exploitation than members of majority clans. Based on our survey, we found that Bantu households were subject, on average, to $300 per year in zakat demanded from them, $60 a month as a house tax, loss of more than 20% of remittances, and 50% of their harvests taken by Al-Shabaab. Members of other clans also were subject to these kinds of this type of extraction, and yet the amounts were less than for the Bantu. Bantu boys were also conscripted at age 13 and on average and received 1/3 the salary of a boy from another clan. We found that this was the case in all of the areas, but there was less exploitation of the Bantu closer to the areas that have now been where Al-Shabaab doesn't have a foothold as much as it did before as a result of military action. And finally, our findings with regard to forced marriage. We found that all girls in this area were threatened by the possibility of forced marriage, and that the average age was 16. But we found that for Bantu girls, marriage to Al-Shabaab fighters was on average at a younger age, and that these girls typically stayed with their own families. They were not integrated into the families and the households of their husband. So it's very difficult to call this a marriage. This is a form, we feel, of extraction, the slavery of young girls. In conclusion, we argue that Al-Shabaab governs using an ethnicized strategy which creates incentives for members of majority clans to perpetuate the wartime economy. We don't think that the U.S. military or international actors, we don't think that they're unaware of this. We just recognize that it's very difficult to work in Somalia without having partners. And so you're, in a way, stuck with the local power dynamics. And yet, we argue that if the United States and its international partners want more than conflict management for years to come in Somalia, they will really need to find ways to fully integrate the Bantu as officers in the Somali military. The Bantu are subject to the greatest exploitation, and therefore they have the greatest incentive in defending their homeland against Al-Shabaab. And so in order to end U.S. involvement in Somalia, it's essential that all Somalis have a place, not only in Somalia's military, but also a fair and representative place within its government. Thank you.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be presenting on police militarization and community cooperation in times of protracted conflict. Specifically, my presentation today looks at different dimensions of militarization and how they influence cooperation in Kismayo in Somalia. When we think about the literature on police militarization, the prevailing perspective is that it has an inherent capacity to undermine community perceptions towards the police, specifically community trust and community willingness to cooperate with the police. Now, a lot of the empirical evidence that has been used to support this perspective has really been developed and tested within Western democratics context. The few studies that have been done outside of these contexts have provided a bit of a mixed picture. So this led me to question, well, is this always the case? Does militarization always lead to or undermine community perceptions across different people, different communities, different societies, different socio-political contexts? And could there be areas where militarization does have a positive influence on willingness to cooperate with the police, especially in areas of protracted conflict? And so the common through thread that I want to run through this entire presentation today is a recognition that when we're thinking about what truly matters to communities when they're choosing to evaluate the police, we should recognize that this would vary from different societies to another society, and we should keep this in mind. Now, when we think about the definition of police militarization, Kraska provides a very interesting way of conceptualizing militarization that wasn't there prior. He says that we shouldn't really be concerned about whether or not the police are militarized. We should assume that since the inception, the police have to a certain extent been militarized, especially due to the fact that they have a right to exert the use of force. And so when you look at it from this perspective, the question then falls upon us as researchers to determine to what extent are police militarized. And so he presents this idea that we should look at militarization as a continuum. And for us as researchers to find out when we're looking at a civilian police force, to determine where across the continuum does police fall in terms of their militarization. And he presents 4 dimensions of militarization that we can use to evaluate this. And the criteria first starts as police material militarization, which has to do with the weapons and advanced technologies that the police use that are similar to those of the military. The second is cultural militarization, which has to do with the physical appearance, the dress and uniforms that police have, as well as the norms and values that are similar to that of the military model. Then we have operational militarization, which has to do with the patterns of activities and especially the use of paramilitary forces by the police. They're sort of similar to what the military do. And lastly, we have organizational militarization, which has to do with how the police organize themselves in a way that is similar to a military model. Now, a lot of the proponents or those who are in support of militarization often argue from the perspective that militarization presents the inherent capacity to improve police performance, as well as the capacity for the police to continually professionalize through militarization. However, those who are critical pretty much argue that performance, first of all, is not improved by militarization, and on the contrary, it actually ends up undermining community perceptions. And nowhere is this argument more clearly established than in Tyler's literature. Right? Tyler presents this perspective. He says there's this perspective when he talks about the performance without legitimacy paradox. He says that in Western democratic context, there has been, over the last 20 or so years, there has been an increase in police performance, but ultimately there's been a decline in community perceptions towards the police, especially police legitimacy. And he said the reason for this paradox is that the police are not truly focused on what truly matters to the people. And they're not really evaluating what matters to them. And what matters to them, Tyler argues, are normative considerations, which are tied to the quality of treatment and quality of decision-making by the police. If the police treat you fairly, if they treat you with dignity and respect, they allow you to voice your decisions, voice your concerns before they make decisions, and they remain neutral, you're more likely to trust them, accord them legitimacy, and then you're more likely to be willing to cooperate with them. And he argues that these normative considerations have very little to do with rational self-interest that has to do with things like evaluating whether the police are performing their roles effectively. Are they catching rule breakers? Are they maintaining security and order and stability? So he argues that this is not the case. However, again, a lot of the literature that is supportive of this perspective is really established in Western democratic context. And the few studies done outside present this more mixed bag picture. And so led me to consider, well, what about instrumental considerations, right? Could there be societies out there where what truly matters to them is the concerns about security, stability, maintaining law, catching rule breakers, and other performative instrumental considerations. When they're evaluating the police, this is what they're considering. And if we think that there are societies who value this, particularly areas of protracted conflict, the militarization perhaps may signal to the communities the ability of the police to actually perform their duties effectively. Especially when you think of a context where there's an active insurgent group that is considered to at times be more capable and lethal than the security actors themselves, right? And so if a community member is weighing the costs and benefits of cooperating with the police, they may choose to cooperate with the police if they perceive the police is actually capable of doing something when they report, let's say, a crime to the police, right? And so in this context, militarization may actually matter. And so when I was looking for a case study to evaluate this, what am I hypothesizing here, Kismayo seemed to be the perfect opportunity to be able to test this theory. Because when we think about policing in Kismayo, we don't even think of it as the way it is conceptualized in the West. And Hills best explains this in this quote. She argues that some of these technical definitions of what policing means that is established in Western context don't necessarily fit in the context of Somalia, especially in areas of Kismayo. Policing in this area is more dynamic. And it's more dynamic for two reasons. One hand, as some of the colleagues have pointed out, policing is still very much tied to identity-based politics, largely around the clan. But it's also dynamic because security, at least when I was conducting my fieldwork in Kismayo, something that consistently kept coming up is that communities' perceptions about the police are tied up with also their perceptions towards other security actors. Communities recognize that the police are only able to effectively conduct their activities as law enforcement within the city because of the presence of other security actors operating at the periphery that are providing some sort of enough stability for the police to operate within the city. And this is something that interestingly filters down to even the regular community members on the ground. So recognizing, especially the activities of a paramilitary force known as the Darawish. Communities recognize that the only reason the police are able to operate or function is because of this presence of these Darawish actors outside of the outside of the city that are maintaining enough security for the police to operate internally. And so when we're thinking about community perceptions of the police, we have to disentangle it from community perceptions towards the Darawish actors. It's not like here where in the Metropolitan Police in DC, for them to perform or even just conduct their regular day-to-day, they're not necessarily reliant on the SWAT team to actually do their jobs. Those two can be separate. So recognizing this idea that militarization has different dimensions to it, and recognizing that in Somalia we need to think of policing as more dynamic, I present these two hypotheses that I wanted to test in my study. One is that some, if not all four measures of militarization of the police would have a positive influence on individuals' willingness to cooperate with the police due to these instrumental considerations that I mentioned earlier. And now we also have a second hypothesis, is because we have to disentangle perceptions towards the police from those of the paramilitary forces like Darawish, I hypothesize similarly with regard to the Darawish, that there would be this positive impact of perceived militarization of Darawish. In terms of the data that I used to evaluate the study, I conducted field surveys of community members in Kismayo, as well as in-depth interviews conducted both in Kismayo, Nairobi, and in Washington, D.C. I won't go too deep into the methodologies used to collect the data, and if you have any questions on this, we can discuss it after the presentation. But what I will draw your attention to is that I collected 323 surveyed individuals. Everybody was surveyed in Somali language, and then we were 16 individuals interviewed both in English, Swahili, and English and Swahili. I'll move on to the measures of interest for this current study. The outcome of interest in this case is willingness to cooperate with the police. And here I use two measures. One is, would you be willing to call the police to report a crime? And the other is, would you be willing to help the police with information that would be helpful for an investigation? And both of these measures are binary. That means that 0 indicates that people are somewhat willing or unwilling, and 1 indicates that they're willing. In terms of the explanatory factors, what we think would motivate cooperation is really this measures of militarization. And if you really think about it, there'll be 8 measures of militarization in this study. So that would be material, cultural, operational, and organizational militarization, but now for the police, and then the same measures now measured for Darawish. And these are community perceptions of whether the Darawish are militarized across the 4 dimensions of militarization, and police are militarized across the 4 dimensions. All 8 measures are binary, which means yes, 1 meaning yes, they are militarized, and 0 meaning no, they're not militarized at all. I also made sure to include control variables that are relevant to the study, including Tyler's arguments that actually normative factors would truly matter. And so I'm controlling for all these Tyler's arguments as well as other factors that are conceived to be important for explaining cooperation when it comes to these contexts and cooperation writ large. The method I used was a logit model. The only reason I present this here is to make sure that you understand that the parameters that we're really concerned about are those on the 4 dimensions of militarization, the betas on those. We're trying to see if is this positive relationship. Now let's look at the findings. So what we do find is a very interesting picture. So when you look at this image, I want you to focus on the green means that there is a positive relationship, and red means that there's a negative relationship. And what we find is that certain measures actually have a positive impact or positive relationship with willingness to cooperate with the police, and other dimensions of militarization actually have a negative. And interestingly, it's the measures that have to do with the outward appearance of militarization that actually do have this positive influence. If people perceive the police to be militarized materially, that they carry such advanced technologies or weaponry, then there's a 11 percentage point increase in willingness to call the police. Similarly, if they think the police are militarized culturally, or the Darawish are militarized culturally, which has to do with the outward appearance, the dress, the uniforms, and you see that this has this 18 percentage point or 23 percentage point increase in willingness to call the police. Interestingly, also, it's only the measures on Darawish militarization that actually have this negative influence. When we look at police operational militarization, which was measured with we ask community members, do you believe that the police actively use the Darawish in internal operations? You find that there's this negative association with willingness to cooperate with the police. And then when we ask communities whether they believe that Darawish is militarized materially, there's this negative impact. What can we take away from this? Well, we can conclude two things. One is that normative factors are not the dominant explanation for willingness to cooperate, at least not in this context of protracted conflict. And we can't say that we can't generalize Tyler's work to context of protracted conflict. And other factors, especially things related to instrumental considerations, may actually matter more in certain contexts. But also, another important conclusion that I want to focus a bit more time on is this idea that certain dimensions have a positive impact and some don't, right? The ones that have a positive impact, the story have already laid out for you. It's pretty clear. If you think that militarization signals the performative aspect of police, then you're more likely to cooperate. But then you have this other idea that the measures on Darawish militarization have a negative impact. It may be that there are three possible explanations for this. One is that people may be fearful of Darawish, and so and this is not necessarily far-fetched. There have been alleged reports of human rights abuses by Darawish, but everybody that I interviewed for my qualitative interviews and people who are unrelated and corroborated one another emphatically argued that the Darawish are positively conceptualized by the local communities. And even when I was on the ground, that's something that I could pick up on. They recognize the instrumental value of having Darawish at the forefront. So then why do we see this negative impact? So this presents two possible reasons for this. On the one hand, it could be that if the communities think that Darawish have been used in internal operations and they recognize that how effective they are at combating Shabaab, and then you hear that they're being used in internal operations, then you might be feeling comfortable, right? You may feel confident then. You'll be like, well, Darawish has things handled, then there's perhaps no need for me to report. A second explanation would be that, and keep in mind that I collected this data over the summer, which is right before the heightened Jubaland elections, where a lot of rumor spreading was occurring about potential attacks in the city. And then you hear that Darawish, which is your main fighting force, that is very effective, is being deployed internally. A concern would be that, hey, the threat level must be so high within the city that we even had to bring Darawish inside. So that may lead people to, when they're weighing the costs and benefits of reporting, be like, the threat is too hard, there's high, perhaps there's no need for me to report. Ultimately, moving forward, I would like to disentangle this a bit further, but this provides sort of a preliminary analysis to see that how different dimensions of militarization and especially instrumental considerations could have positive and also negative influences on willingness to cooperate with the police. So I'm going to just reiterate the contributions of this study, which is pretty much what I had said in the beginning, recognizing that we should think more, when thinking about evaluating how people look at the police, we should keep in mind that this may vary from different context to context. So my study presents this new mixed methods empirical data that would be useful for evaluating this, but it also helps us expand our understanding of cooperation and also what Tyler presents, and kind of it tells us to think about expanding some of our research to different contexts and recognizing the instrumental considerations, not just the normative considerations that seem to be dominant within the literature. The instrumental factors may actually matter more in different contexts. There are some limitations to my study. One big one was translating the surveys into Somali. We managed to do it ultimately, but it took days of intense back and forth with multiple different consultants on the ground in Kismayo, and I think we need to kind of be able to come up with solid measures of key indicators that may not easily translate into Somali. Access to the population was also a bit of a challenge, especially around the elections. Also trying to have a bigger sample size. 323 survey completed was pretty good, but I think moving forward it would be better to be useful to collect data maybe annually so that we can be able to pull data across time and see how these factors change. And this would also help, pulling that data across different time periods would also help identify causal mechanisms that underlie some of these findings. Thank you, and if you have any questions, let me know.